You're watching Histroa Finance, where history meets money and where the hidden economics behind world-changing events are uncovered. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this video so more people can learn how money has silently shaped our world. And tell us in the comments what topic you want us to explore next. We'll make a video on your favorite story. Now, let's dive deep into the untold truth of World War I. Not the war fought in trenches or skies, but the one fought in vaults, banks, and balance sheets. This was not just a war of trenches and artillery. It was not only fought with bayonets and barbed wire. World War I was also a financial war, one waged in gold reserves, in bond markets and central banks, and in the secret offices of financiers who never stepped onto the battlefield. The soldiers paid in blood. But the bankers and governments, they calculated in ledgers. What they did during those years didn't just determine who won or lost. It rewired the global financial system in ways that still affect you today. If you think war is only about politics and armies, think again. The First World War proved that money is a weapon, and one of the deadliest ever created. In 1914, Europe was already a powder keg. National rivalries, colonial ambitions, and complex alliances had turned the continent into a chessboard of paranoia. But beneath all the talk of honor and empire, there was a colder truth. Wars of that scale were impossible to fight without unimaginable sums of money. And here's the brutal reality. When leaders chose war, they also chose debt. Every empire, marching its troops to the front lines, was also marching its people into a future of financial burden. At the start, most governments believed the war would be short, maybe over by Christmas. They thought they could pay for it the old-fashioned way, with gold, limited borrowing, and patriotic donations. But within weeks, that illusion collapsed. The war was burning money faster than anyone imagined. The gold standard collapses. In the summer of 1914, Europe's financial system still revolved around the gold standard. Nations promised that their paper currencies could be exchanged for real gold, a system that gave confidence but also tied governments' hands. Gold reserves were finite. You couldn't just print money endlessly without losing the trust of your people or your creditors. Britain, France, and Germany all had decent reserves, but once millions of men were mobilized and industries shifted to weapon production, costs exploded. Germany alone was spending over 10 million marks per day by late 1914. Britain's war costs soon reached £2.5 million every single day. The math was merciless. The gold would not last. So, one by one, governments suspended the rules. They abandoned the gold standard, quietly admitting that money was now only a promise backed by faith in the state. That moment, the breaking of the gold anchor, was one of the most important financial turning points in modern history. It revealed how fragile the so-called real wealth of nations truly was. Money and power were now unshackled from metal and tied instead to printing presses, credit, and persuasion. And once governments tasted that freedom, they never went back. The German strategy: borrowing from the people. For Germany, isolated from global markets and blockaded by the Royal Navy, domestic borrowing became the only option. Berlin launched massive bond drives, appealing to patriotism and urging citizens to pour their savings into war loans. Posters of heroic soldiers filled the streets. Families were told to sacrifice luxuries for the fatherland, with promises that investors would be repaid after victory. In total, Germany raised over 100 billion marks. But it was a pyramid built on hope. When defeat came, those bonds became worthless. Millions of Germans lost their life savings, and that bitterness became fertile ground for extremism in the decades ahead. Economic history always leaves scars. Britain and the American connection. Now, Britain, however, had one major advantage. London was the financial capital of the world. Sterling was trusted, and its network stretched across the globe. At first, the British government relied on short-term borrowing and patriotic appeals, but soon it tapped deeper into global credit. Crucially, it turned to the United States. In 1914, America was officially neutral, but its bankers smelled opportunity. Firms like J.P. Morgan and Co. became the financial lifeline of Britain and France, arranging vast loans and managing purchases of weapons, food, and raw materials. By 1917, when America itself entered the war, Wall Street had already been bankrolling the Allied cause for years. This wasn't charity, it was power. American bankers earned millions in fees, and the United States emerged from the war transformed. From debtor to creditor, from financial follower to global leader. If you've ever wondered how the 20th century became the American century, it started here. Not on the battlefields, but in the balance sheets. France, and the burden of debt France, faced its own dilemmas, already weakened by the costs of building defenses and haunted by its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. France relied heavily on borrowing, both domestic and international. French citizens, known for their saving habits, were persuaded to buy government bonds. But much of the deeper funding again came from across the Atlantic. Like Britain, France became increasingly dependent on American capital. That dependency would shape post-war politics when repayment became a painful source of tension. The interwar economic crises were not just about reparations or stock markets. They were about the crushing weight of wartime debt. Russia. Collapse and revolution. Russia's financial war was a disaster. The empire was vast but underdeveloped, with a fragile banking system and insufficient gold reserves. To fund its war effort, Russia borrowed heavily from allies, especially France. But as defeats mounted and inflation soared, faith in the ruble collapsed. By 1917, the Russian economy was in ruins, and the political system followed. The fall of the Czar wasn't only about ideology or bad generals. It was about a financial system stretched beyond its limits. Economic chaos fueled revolution. Once again, money and power marched together into history. The cost of war. The scale of the financial mistakes was staggering. By the end of the war, the Allied powers had spent over $140 billion. The Central Powers, about $60 billion. These sums were unprecedented, many times greater than the total pre-war national incomes of those nations. The result wasn't just mountains of debt, but the destruction of the old global financial order. The gold standard, once the foundation of trust, was shattered. Inflation tore through economies. Germany would soon face hyperinflation so severe that a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Ordinary people, workers, savers, small investors, were the ones who paid the price. The wealthy elites often protected themselves by moving assets abroad or investing in tangible goods. The lesson was brutal. In a financial war, the small saver bleeds first. The lesson that still applies. World War I taught governments that they could finance the unimaginable by detaching money from reality. They learned they could suspend gold, print endlessly, issue bonds, borrow across borders, and later patch the ruins with propaganda and restructuring. Sound familiar? Because the playbook has never disappeared. Every modern crisis, from the Great Depression to the 2008 financial crash, echoes 1914. When leaders or central banks say, "This is temporary," remember? They said the same thing in 1914, and millions believed them, right up until their currency became worthless, or aftermath in the new financial order. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the world was a financial battlefield. The United States, once a debtor, now held the largest gold reserves and creditor position in history. Europe, the old heart of global finance, was drowning in debt. Britain owed the US over $4 billion. France, more than $3 billion. The war had turned Wall Street into the new financial capital of the world, a shift no cannon could have achieved, but this transition came with its own traps. When wars are funded by borrowing, repayment becomes another kind of war. Britain and France, desperate to maintain faith with their citizens, who had bought war bonds, now had to squeeze money from Germany through reparations. The Treaty of Versailles demanded an astronomical 132 billion gold marks. It was meant to punish, but it was also a fantasy. Germany could not pay. Every attempt to do so, whether by printing money or transferring goods, destabilized its economy further. The hyperinflation of 1923, when Germans carried wheelbarrows of notes just to buy bread, was the direct consequence of impossible debts. It sowed the rage that extremists would later harvest. Britain's mistake and America's rise. Britain tried to restore its prestige by returning to the gold standard in 1925, pegging the pound to its pre-war value. But this was an enormous blunder. The British economy was weak, industries damaged, debts high. Forcing the pound back to its old rate was like setting a broken bone without healing it first. The result? Deflation, unemployment, and unrest. Meanwhile, the United States, flush with gold and confidence, began lending money back to Europe. German reparations payments flowed to Britain and France, which then paid the US a circular flow of money that seemed stable but was built on illusion. When the Great Depression struck, the entire structure collapsed. The world had never been more financially interlinked, nor more fragile. The hidden continuity. The First World War was not just a military turning point. It was an economic revolution. It showed that governments could inflate currencies, borrow on unprecedented scales, and still persuade citizens they were doing the right thing. It proved that propaganda could turn debt into patriotism. Ordinary savers handed over their wealth for bonds that would never be repaid, while the real winners sat in boardrooms, not trenches. Money and power fused tighter than ever, and the world still lives with those consequences. The modern parallel. Think about today. When central banks promise inflation is temporary, when governments raise debt ceilings year after year, when new money is created digitally with a keystroke, Remember 1914. The gold standard wasn't abandoned by accident. It was abandoned by necessity and design. The pattern of borrowing against the future, of printing to cover the present, of selling bonds wrapped in patriotic slogans, it's more than a century old. Every modern crisis carries its DNA, from the stagflation of the 1970s to the subprime collapse of 2008. The same illusions persist, and the same victims remain. The small saver, the middle-class worker, the ordinary citizen. The hidden financial battle behind World War I isn't a relic. It's the foundation of the modern economy. Money, once untethered from reality, becomes a tool of manipulation. Governments will always find ways to finance wars, bailouts, and crises, and they'll always make you pay for it through taxes, inflation, or the erosion of your savings. Real wealth isn't numbers on a screen. It's resilience, knowledge, and awareness. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The financial playbook of 1914 has been rewritten countless times. The outcome is always the same. Those in power protect themselves. Those without knowledge are sacrificed. Never assume money is real just because it's printed. Never assume the system is stable just because the authorities say so. The truth is always hidden in the balance sheets. And history, as always, is the only teacher that never lies. You've been watching Histroa Finance, where we uncover the money behind history. If this documentary gave you a new perspective, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments which topic you want to see next. We'll make a video on your favorite story. Because here at Histroa Finance, we believe that understanding history is the key to mastering your financial future.